Ready. Good morning and welcome to this special event hosted by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. I'm Patti Newberry, SPJ's national president, and I'd like to thank the New England chapter, especially Adam Sennett, for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. Our conversation today is focused on the lack of diversity in newsrooms and how it impacts the journalism coming out of those newsrooms. Joining me are Dorothy Tucker, investigative reporter with CBS 2 in Chicago and president of the National Association of Black Journalists. Also with me, Hugo Balta. Hugo is news director of WTTW, Chicago's PBS affiliate, and he is the president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And lastly, we have Nicole Dungca. Nicole is a reporter at the Washington Post and Senior Vice President of the Asian American Journalists Association. So welcome all three, and let me start by setting the stage just a bit. On May 25th, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis after police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 45 seconds. In the days that followed, protesters took to the streets of Minneapolis and then across the country and across the globe to protest police misconduct and systemic racism in policing and many other facets of American life. Over those weeks, journalists covering that story have also had occasion to look inward at their own newsrooms, to consider the diversity of their staffs and of their storytelling. Those stories became necessary because of events both inside and outside of newsrooms. Omar Jimenez, a correspondent for CNN who is Black and Latino, was arrested on the air after the first night of protests in Minneapolis. At the New York Times, opinion editor James Bennett resigned after Times staffers, many of them persons of color, objected to a guest column that he ran from Senator Tom Cotton calling for military intervention to stop protests. At the Philadelphia Inquirer, the editor resigned after his paper published a front page story with the headline, "Buildings Matter Too." At the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, a reporter was taken off protest coverage after she tweeted a fairly jokey image related to protests. In Detroit, a Black reporter was targeted by police while his white colleagues were not. At Refinery 29, the editor resigned. At Bon Appetit, the editor resigned, both after staffers accused them of racist practices and policies. And very importantly, all of these moves and more reopened conversations inside newsrooms about diversity at a time when persons of color make up about 22% of all newsroom staff and about 19% of newsroom management positions. So let's get to it with our three guests, with an invitation for you, our listeners, to be adding your questions and comments in the chat field, and we'll get to those after a bit. So let's start. Let's start by addressing the moment with two particular questions. First of all, obvious, but let's put it on the record. Why is this an important conversation? Why do we need to be talking about diversity in newsrooms and diversity of coverage? And secondly, what is your group specifically doing to address this moment? And so, can we start maybe with Nicole?
Sure. I think, well, it's a very obvious reason to be looking within your newsrooms about diversity. If you see what's going on in the streets, it's very obvious that these are people who are calling for racial equality. They're protesting police brutality, but I think in a larger sense, there's also a big emphasis on the Black community within this country. And when we think about how we're representing that in our coverage, every single newsroom, I think, can do a better job of recruiting those Black journalists, making sure those voices are being heard. And with all of our organizations, I know that we're all looking at this moment trying to support the Black journalists, our colleagues, and at AAJA, we're trying to do that in our own way. Obviously, we want to lift those voices and support organizations like NABJ, organizations like NAHJ at a time like this, but also look within our own communities. I think within the Asian community, there's a very obvious, it's obvious to people within the Asian community that there's a history of anti-Blackness there. And so at least at AAJA, we've really been encouraging those kinds of conversations. Some of our affinity groups within our organization are talking about, how we can talk to various people, like in our families and our communities, about this kind of anti-Blackness that we see and how that can actually help change the culture that is behind some of these protests. So even just beyond saying, we support our colleagues, we're trying to do the work so that we're able to actually help change the culture right now.
Thanks very much. Dorothy, why is this an important conversation, and what is NABJ doing at this moment to address the situation?
Obviously for NABJ, it affects us personally. It affects our members personally. There is probably not a Black person that I know who has not been the victim of racism or experienced a negative interaction, perhaps with a police officer, or they know someone who has. They have inner circles, people in their inner circle who have had negative experiences. So it is something that is definitely important that we have this conversation in the Black community, because we are the ones who are being targeted by the police. We are the ones who are experiencing much of the racism that goes on in this country. We are the ones that are being traumatized. We are the ones who can't, when it comes to sleeping in the car, walking down the street, jogging, and the list is long. All of those things impact Black people. And then when you transfer that over to coverage, this is an important conversation, because it is important that we tell the truth about what is happening in America. It is important that you see more African Americans, journalists in the newsroom, so that we can make sure that the coverage is fair, that the coverage is accurate, that the coverage is complete. It is ultra important that we have more Black managers in the newsroom, because had there been probably someone of color or been a Black person at the table, you would not have seen some of the incidents that you have seen in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in New York, in Detroit. Again, the list is long. Had there been someone of color in the room, had that voice been there. What is NABJ doing? What we've always done. Our mission is to advocate for Black journalists. Our mission is to be the voice. This is something that we've done for 40 some odd years. So we are just continuing everything that we've always done, is to advocate on behalf of our members, is to talk to the news managers and the news companies, and constantly stressing the importance of having Black managers in top positions. Now we're probably expanding it, in that we are also saying to those same managers, and we're looking at the systemic racism that exists within the newsroom, and having conversations about how do we address the microaggressions. How do we make sure that our members don't feel like if they say something, they're going to be retaliated against. And I can tell you that is their fear at this time. But those are the things that we are, at this time, having to deal with. You will see a lot that will come out in the next few weeks. You've seen us make our formal statement about capitalizing Black. We are bound to put out a formal statement about the use of mugshots. Things that will improve the coverage in the African American community and in the newsroom. You'll see a lot more.
I'd like to take up that question of the capitalization of Black as we go along. But let's go to Hugo first. Hugo, why is this an important conversation? And what is your group doing to address the issues on the table right now?
Well, look, first of all, I agree 100% with my colleagues. This is not something new to us. NAHJ is celebrating more than 35 years. So these conversations we've been having for more than 3 decades. And I think the conversations that are happening that start with the Black community around racial discrimination and policing has now gone to other conversations of systemic racism, like we've seen in marketing, last week with Aunt Jemima and others. And of course, our industry as well, this incident, this moment in time is sparking those same conversations. So you said it best, 22% of people of color are in newsroom. I think you said 19% in management, and that's at the core of the problem. The homogeneous leadership across the board, regardless of platform, that sets the table, that trickles down to the rest of the operation. And so often what happens when you're covering the civic unrest in the last couple of weeks, in the aftermath of George Floyd, it's often the narrative of someone that is not a member of that community. It's someone that is covering a story, not really understanding what's at the core of the protest and the differentiation between the protest and property damage, and sometimes the bridge between them. Not having that understanding is part of the problem in the storytelling. It's part of the issues that are happening in the newsrooms and in the stories that they're producing. As far as what NHJ is doing, again, similar to our colleagues at NABJ and AAJA, but we've also started to say, we're done with just asking for a seat at the table. We're now building our own table. And last year we launched Palabra, which is an independent news outlet that leverages the experience and talent that we have in our organization, nearly 2,500, many of them freelance writers, reporters, journalists that are producing content from the perspective of the community. And in doing that, really augmenting the conversation that is often superficial in mainstream media. And so examples about, for example, the coverage of immigration that is often just scratching the surface when you look across the board at mainstream media, we're producing in Palabra with a lot of depth that provides a perspective that is lacking in the news space.
Mm-hmm. Palabra, so that was launched last year?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And is it a platform for freelance writing, did you say?
Right. It's a digital platform that is run by one of our members and leverages and hires journalists from across the country in specific assignments that are pertinent and relevant to Hispanic Latinos across the country.
Great, very tangible result. So let's take this a little more to your own workplaces, just as some examples, some anecdotal examples about what kinds of conversations are happening in your places of work. And Nicole, I'll start with you again. You're at the Washington Post. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. I was a little confused earlier. You're at the Washington Post. It's a big newsroom. I assume there's some amount of diversity, but what kinds of conversations are you having amongst yourself, and are your leaders initiating that look at issues of diversity of staff and diversity of coverage?
Yeah, I think, well, actually in the last few days, I think we are lucky to have some tangible actions from our newsroom. There was an announcement from the publisher that we were going to add about a dozen more positions that were specifically looking at race in America and diversity within our coverage. And so that included a managing editor for diversity and inclusion who will be able to look a lot at our coverage and convene the kind of conversations that can help make sure that we're truly capturing all sides of the conversation. But it also means having a multiculturalism beat writer, having a criminal justice beat writer that will be very focused on the disparities that that exist and that we have a lot of communities of color have long known, and that, you know, honestly, sometimes feel like various communities are just finding out about now, but like Dorothy and Hugo have been saying, like these kinds of issues, they are not new. And so both having those specific beats, I think is very important, but I think if you are a journalist of color who's advocating for diversity in the newsrooms, you also know that race should be a part of every single person's beat. And I think you see that with a lot of your individual, with your colleagues, but I think that's a conversation that will be happening a lot more in newsrooms, where if you're covering any kind of beat, whether it's city hall or education, that there are aspects of racial disparities that need to be covered all the time. And I think that's going to be a really important conversation that people should be having now.
Well, that's great. So when you say the publisher has committed to these 12 positions, you mean Mr. Bezos is going to fund 12 new positions that have a central...
Fred Ryan and...
oh, sorry.
And so,
Owner,
yeah.
Publisher, different thing, right? Fred Ryan has, that's, and has that been announced publicly?
That's been publicly announced. We luckily have a very active guild in some of those positions they had been advocating for. And so I think it's a very good start. Obviously, this isn't the end for any newsroom. I think these are just issues that, you know, we're going to just have to continually work at. It's not something that's going to happen overnight by hiring people, but I think it's a really good start, and we'll be able to continue trying to get the kind of diversity that we want within these newsrooms.
Great. Are those positions posted yet for people who
They
are
are. So if you do want to work at the Post, please go look up those positions.
Excellent.
We'd love to have you.
That's really great news. Let's move to Hugo. What's happening in your newsroom there in Chicago that's reacting to the moment?
Well, look, I think with not only the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, but before it, and really even now, the COVID-19 pandemic, it was very important for us to tell this story from many different perspectives. So even though we as a city in Chicago, state of Illinois, certainly in the country, we all have a shared experience in regards to COVID-19, especially around social distancing, stay home, stay safe orders, we knew that how different communities are experiencing COVID-19 would differ, beginning with race, gender, socioeconomic background, education. So it was imperative for us to quickly make a decision to co-anchor every night from different neighborhoods throughout Chicagoland, telling the COVID-19 story from the north side, west side, and south side, understanding that because of separation, but not only geographically, but also because of of race and again, education, access to healthcare, and so on, that needed to be told. And in doing so, we were producing authentic storytelling that is building bridges between communities and also educating the overall the public. The same thing applies in covering the protests, in covering the property damage, in covering the debates and discussion in the racial discrimination, systemic racial discrimination in policing. So what our newsroom has shifted to is a bedrock that begins with diversity, inclusion, and equity in order to achieve our responsibility of journalists to being fair and accurate. We cannot be fair and accurate if we're only telling the story from where we're headquartered in the north side. We cannot fulfill our duty as journalists if we're producing a story, an overarching story, an umbrella, as if COVID-19 in the aftermath of George Floyd is experienced the same way across all of Chicago. Chicago is a very diverse market, a community that's made up of many different communities, people, again, beginning by race, gender, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. So integrating D&I and equity in our day-to-day has afforded us to be fair and accurate and be better journalists.
Very good. And this policy of co-anchoring from different parts of the city as you go along on both of these giant stories, did that pre-exist? Was that the policy and the practice before COVID and before the protests?
So I joined WTTW in February, and a month later, we were knee-deep in the pandemic. I think WTTW has a long history of excellent journalism, and we were talking about fulfilling our mission around diversity and inclusion and equity. It's something that was set into place by our CEO and president, Sandra Michek. But when COVID-19 struck, and then we had to simultaneously look at keeping crews safe by separating the news team. We quickly accelerated a lot of the conversations that we were talking about around diversity and inclusion and equity that we really thought we were going to roll out throughout the year progressively. It accelerated our strategy, our redefining the culture, the newsroom culture, with positive results. And then when the death of George Floyd happened, we just again took a page from that playbook and telling this story as well.
Very good. So Dorothy, you're in Chicago as well at the CBS affiliate. So same question for you. What has your newsroom been doing? What is it doing? What will it do to rise to the moment?
You know, I think we've been really fortunate at WBBM. We have a news director, I think he's been there maybe a couple of years now, and I saw changes when he came in. You know, I think if you look around television stations today at the managers, we have a Black executive producer for our, excuse me, our 10 o'clock show, which is our show of record. The 10 o'clock producer is Black. You know, so within the editorial process, he came in and promoted to the show of record 2 Black women to run the show that again is what everybody watches. I think that really kind of set the tone for our newsroom. We've had some other Black hires that I've seen again in key positions. So, you know, I am encouraged by what I have seen and what I am seeing. Now there are conversations that are going on about when the hiring freeze is over, new hires that we will make, and not just a concerted effort to reach out and make sure that we hire a person of color, in particular a Black journalist, but that there is a procedure in place to make sure that that happens. You know, that someone knows exactly where to go, who to reach out to in order to find the talent and quickly get those positions filled. And that's just within our shop. But, you know, I'd like to just make sure that people who are listening understand what we're doing on a national basis. You know, I really have to tell you, I'm very encouraged by the outreach that I am getting and that NABJ is getting from the Washington Post, hearing about those jobs, from the New York Times. There are editors that are calling us across the country. There are news directors that are saying, you know, I want a Black news director. I want a Black assistant news director. I've got an opening for an editor, and I want to make sure that that person is a person of color, and that I want to make sure that we reach out and we connect with NABJ. So if you go to the NABJ.org and you go to our job link page, you will see an increased number of many jobs there, openings that people are actively looking. And probably tomorrow or so, we are now filling what we are calling NABJ Jobs Now. That is a resource page that we will put current listings of jobs that are open right now that people are looking for, because we want our members to know that this is indeed a time to be able to find a job. So it's, you know, it's important to us that we make sure that those who are industry know that they can come to us, because we do have that resource. You know, we do have a talent base there. So, you know, for me, it's been a little bit more of the bigger picture And we created a producer database about 1.5 years ago. We have more than 100 producers on that database. So let me just say to anybody who's out there looking for a producer, looking for somebody in top management, we have the database. We established an editors database about 6 months ago. That one is building, but we do have a database of editors who are ready and able to fill the positions that they are now looking for. At the same time, we want the news managers to know that, we are more than willing to send them the candidates, and we do want them to let us know what those positions are available. And, we will take advantage of this, of what's happening now. I'm glad to see that,
Yeah.
that people are looking.
Well, that is a terrific resource. And again, great for listeners here to know about that you can go to the NABJ site and find those links. So would you say that that's a change in your mind, Dorothy? This kind of very intentional, very deliberate, we want a Black producer, we want a Black news manager, news director, we want a Black editor, where news organizations are willing to state that very deliberately, that is part of their priority in a particular hire.
Absolutely, it is a change, and it feels good. I have had personal conversations with a number of editors. I've had texts come to me, and it's interesting. The conversations are, okay, I want an editor-in-chief now in this newsroom because things are changing. And in order for us to get other people hired, to make sure that the other hires are of color, they want somebody at the top to kind of set that tone. And things are changing in their community. So that is the other reason that they want to make sure that they have somebody of color who is sensitive to what's going on in the community, who understands that, as Hugo says, that you have to cover the underlying reasons of the protests that we see. And, you need somebody who can look at the larger picture. So I have not had these conversations prior to 2 months ago, and I've only been in office less than a year, but I don't think my predecessors had the kind of outreach that we are seeing on a consistent basis. I wish I could show you the emails that I'm getting and the text message that I'm getting, saying, yes, we want somebody, please send somebody to us now, please help us. And that is the other thing that's important that they're saying. They're kind of admitting that we are not quite sure how to deal with the issues. We're not quite sure, how to find the people that we need. So we're more than willing to help them with that as well.
And
Very good.
if I could add, Patti,
Sure.
to a little bit to what Dorothy's saying, because again, NAHJ, and I'm sure AAJA has not just now, but in our perennial national conferences and also at the local level, we're always hearing, absolutely, we want more diversity in our newsrooms. We want those producers, those executive producers, those news directors. And to be skeptical, that's don't just talk the talk, walk the talk, because very often our organizations are asking media companies to be very transparent with the demographics of their newsrooms. And they are, with few exceptions, CBS being one of them, reluctant to open up their books because they know they have a negative story to tell. So it's great that they talk a good game, but what needs to happen is give us a finite time where you're going to actually assertively fulfill what you're saying, and then be transparent about where are the areas for improvement. We're not looking to shame anyone. Our organizations were founded in order to assist in being diverse and inclusive and to produce better journalism. By being transparent about your demographics, it helps us help you. So I am skeptical. I'm certainly having similar conversations, but it's all for naught if in the next 6 to 12 months we're not seeing those news directors being hired, those executive producers being hired, those reporters being hired, et cetera. And it can't just be because they often say, we got to start at entry level. That's wonderful. But if you want to affect change now, not for the next generation, you have to be very methodical and purposeful in hiring in management and in key visible roles with resources.
And I got to tell you, Hugo, I mean, we intend to follow up, and I know you do too. You know, we intend to go back 3 months from now, because I don't want to even give them 6 months. I want to give them 3 months from now to see, did you fill those positions? Because if you're out there just to check the box, that's just not going to work. You know, if you just want to get somebody in to say, yes, I interviewed them, I interviewed somebody Black, you know, I tried to look. And that is the one thing that is the most frustrating thing to me, is that I know it comes down to, well, you know, we have this position open and we need to fill this position now. So, you know, we can't take as much time as we want, and then you end up interviewing some folks and you don't end up hiring a person of color because you need to do it quickly. So we want to see a process in place where all along, you know, you can go back and you can pull up that resume of that person that maybe you didn't hire before and make sure that somebody of color is hired today. You know, we'll be checking in on them, because I'm not going to be happy if there's all of this yay, rah, 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 and 3 to 6 months from now, we see nothing. That's
right. So, you know, in the moment, in the heat of the moment, you can imagine that news organizations want to do the right thing. They want to give it more than lip service. They put out those, you know, positions, 13 positions at the Washington Post. That's great. But where's the follow through? Let's make sure the follow through. So it really does raise a good question. And that's, who's in charge of the tracking? Who's in charge of accountability here, right? Could it be one of your groups? Is it one of your groups? Do you have a mechanism by which to hold news organizations accountable for the promises that are coming out of our current environment?
We are looking for funding now. One of the things that I've wanted to do since I got in office was to have a report card of every media organization, every outlet, and literally grade them, you know, and that grade is going to be based on hiring, on retention, on promotions, on culture, on the number of managers, on feedback. All of that will go into that research, so we can have a good idea of where you are today, because we want you to compete. Because if you got an F today, if you got a C today, then we want you to do better, and we'll tell you what you need to do better so that you can improve your grade. Now, something that finally, literally, we are in the process of talking to some research firms that may help us, because it costs money. But to what Hugo pointed out before, there's so many organizations that will not give their numbers, and they make it difficult. I mean, ASNE had that problem. You know, RTNDA has had that problem. You know, they refuse to give the numbers. So we have to figure out a way to bring pressure on the media companies to provide the data. And if they won't provide the data, then there's some ideas that I have, because our people work there, you know, for us to provide the data. But this, you know, one thing I thought about, you know, if perhaps, you know, all of these media groups, they want to, maybe they apply, they have they enter awards like the Peabody and the DuPont. You know, is there a way that we can figure out how to say to those groups, in order for, as part of your application process, in order for you to be able to compete in this arena, then we would like for you to provide your numbers. That's an idea that we're pursuing, because it's a great idea to want to do this research, but we need them to give us the numbers, or we'll have to figure out how to get it another way.
Right. Well, that's an idea, to tie it to contest entries. And I like the concept of finding a funder, so you can do this well and have some sustainable structure for the collection of data to put into these report cards. It sounds like a great idea. Ideas, Nicole or Hugo, on how to get kind of compliance, follow through, and accountability.
I mean, I know that our organizations, AAJA, NABJ, NAHJ, we're always happy to be providing that kind of accountability. We're always happy to be working. And I know that our leaders, as well as the leaders of other minority journalist associations, we're working always behind the scenes. We're not just putting out public things, we're working behind the scenes if there are any issues with coverage, or if we feel like it's a very, homogenous population. But I think also what's important about this moment is that it doesn't have to always fall on our organizations. I think what we're seeing in this moment is seeing, people from all communities, white people, seeing the value of diversity. And so that means organizations that aren't dedicated just to diversity, like SPJ, like the ONAs. I mean, this is also a moment for these organizations to help stand with us, stand up, and help us provide the accountability that we've been striving for since the inception of, NABJ, NAHJ, AAJA, the SAJA, South Asians, and for the Native American Journal Associations. I mean, I think one of the big things about this moment is that everybody needs to be standing up for diversity. Everybody needs to know the importance of being diverse and adding more Black, Brown, Asian, Native American, all of these journalists, because it helps our coverage beyond the representation of people being able to see people who look like them and then wanting to be journalists. It also makes our coverage better and makes the moment, makes us chronicle this moment in a way that is truer to what's actually happening. So that's something I would say, that this is something that other organizations should also look toward. Like, is there a way that different organizations can link up with us so that we can hold all of these various organizations accountable?
Well, SPJ stands ready to assist in any way we can, and best of luck in the search for some funding for what sounds like a really worthwhile approach. Hugo, back to you. Other ideas on how to hold news organizations accountable, how to get that desired data to prove that they're making progress?
Yeah, look, same as my colleagues have said for both AAJA and NABJ, but one thing that I'll add is really cutting ties with media companies that perpetually are looking at us once a year because they want that halo. They want to meet with us at the conference. They want to be able to say, we met with the president of NAHJ, we met with the board of directors, we met with the executive director, and then as soon as that conference subsides, it's a ghost town. So for us, it's saying we understand our worth, our value, not just in the Hispanic Latino space, but as one of a fraternity, sorority of other organizations representing marginalized groups. And we're going to say, if we don't see that this relationship is being productive, we're going to cut ties with you. We are fortunately, because of a lot of hard work, beginning with the staff of NAHJ and previous board members, including the one that I'm serving with, we're in a financial state that we can be selective of who we're partnering with. And we have no issue in telling any media company that we will be cutting ties with them because we see that it's a relationship that is just continuously spinning their wheels, and we really feel that they're being taken advantage of. So I think we have to put a line in the sand in regards to our relationships as organizations with media companies. And if it's not productive, there is no dollar amount that is worth the credibility and integrity of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And our members understand that, our members support us in that stance. And I think that is going to have results.
I have about 2 more questions, and then we'll go to some questions from our audience. So first, this is a question that's circulated in newsrooms forever, back in the 80s when I was in the newsrooms, is should the person of color in the newsroom be the person assigned to the stories that relate to race, diversity, etc.? The value of that, or the wisdom of making other choices, right? Should the Black reporter cover the Black stories? So who would like to tackle that?
Well, look, I'll start.
Black.
And I think that it's a responsibility that any person of color has experienced, right? I've often been either the only Hispanic Latino in the editorial meeting or the only person of color in the editorial meeting. And I can't tell you how often when a subject specific to Hispanic and Latinos comes up, the whole room turns around and looks at me. It's a huge responsibility, and I'm a veteran of nearly 30 years, but it's also unfair to a lot of young journalists that are, you know, maybe 5, 10 years into their career. So it's unfair, but it's also something that as a journalist of color, we've learned to embrace. We've learned to feel comfortable in uncomfortable situations where we've had to speak for sometimes our direct communities, if not our greater communities of persons of color. So I think that that is something that many of us are battle tested. Is it fair? Of course not. Does it need to improve? Absolutely. But as ambassadors of our different communities, and especially those represented in this meeting, you know, we've gone the extra mile of actually being involved in our organizations because we understand the importance of having a voice in those newsrooms, and also the fortune that we have in actually either, you know, being the only representative of your community or of marginalized communities. So I think that for us at NAHJ, it's also in training our members that to be comfortable in those uncomfortable situations, because those are opportunities to learning opportunities in many cases. It's an opportunity also to learning in the sense that we provide certain context to the people in those newsrooms and in those meetings. And we know that there's no, you know, magic wand that tomorrow all newsrooms are going to be diverse. So we have to work with what we've got. And one of the things that we're doing at NHJ in the next couple of weeks is coming out with a competency guidebook that's going to help all newsrooms in covering Hispanic Latinos, because we do understand that change is progressive. So what we want to do is help newsrooms create an environment to have those conversations that sometimes is uncomfortable. Again, many times colleagues that are not members of the Hispanic Latino community, you know, take me aside and ask a question, and they're almost apologetic in asking the question, and I tell them, don't be apologetic. Let's have that conversation, because it's going to end up in better journalism down the line. So I think it's important for us to understand that however unfair, it's a responsibility that we need to grab the bull by the horns. But as an organization at NHJ, we need to work not only with the Hispanic Latinos in those newsrooms, but all of the journalists in those newsrooms in better understanding Hispanic Latinos, and in understanding through this cultural competency guidebook and how to do a better job.
Nicole, will you take that next, and then we'll go to Dorothy on that?
Yeah, I mean, like Hugo, AAJA also has, you know, best practices, those kinds of things. But I think in the end, you need to have a newsroom where that does not have to be what is happening. You know, you have to have a newsroom where people don't need, there's only one Black person, there's only one Latino person, there's only one Asian person. And that's the whole point of organizations like ours, trying to diversify these newsrooms and make sure that the pipelines exist. But it also means that being able to responsibly cover race should be everybody's job. Like, everybody should be talking about race and thinking about these kinds of stories, no matter where they work in the newsroom. And I think that's really important for us to realize. It shouldn't just be that only various communities of color, you know, various journalists of color are the ones who are talking about these issues. I think this is a time where it's become very clear that these issues are everybody's issues. These are the stories that affect everybody, especially Black journalists, especially the Black community, but we all need to care about it. We all need to cover it to the best of our abilities. Some of that is getting, you know, more diversity in the newsroom, but it also is making sure that the very fabric of the newsroom means having equity and diversity within within your coverage, and that is for anybody. That means that anybody should be able to cover it in some ways, but that we should especially have diverse newsrooms that will be able to capture the nuances of the conversation.
So let's go to Dorothy, and this will be my last question before we go to our listeners. And let me just put it slightly differently. Dorothy, does a Black journalist do a better job covering a story that has the Black community at the heart of it?
Would you ask that question of a white journalist? Does a white journalist do a better job of covering a story, you know, that
Right,
deals with
right.
white issues? But
No.
you'd never ask that question of a white journalist. That's not fair. You know, we do a better job at most things that we do because we've been raised to work twice as hard in order to be recognized. So we always come to the table with more, you know, and you know,
I guess I asked that because that has been the practice in newsrooms, some newsrooms, right? That has been the decision. So that's why I asked it that way.
I agree.
And is that attitude changing, right? Is that attitude changing?
Well,
Yeah.
let me say this. You know, Black journalists don't mind covering Black stories because we have a different, we bring a nuance to that story. We bring perhaps a better understanding to that story because we live in the communities. So, you know, Black journalists have no issues covering Black stories. Where the frustration comes is that when 80% of the stories that we cover end up being in the Black community and we don't get the opportunity to cover the other stories like our colleagues do. So that when COVID hit and then the stories came out that COVID-19 was disproportionately affecting the Black community, then you saw more Blacks then covering the COVID stories. And then of course with the protest, you know, because Black reporters in the newsroom and because, you know, they may have more connections to the community, now they're covering the protest. You know, they're tired. They're tired because they're looked upon as saying, well, you know, you're Black, you should get out there and cover this. And, you know, so they're working 7 days a week and they're working long hours and it never stops. All I want to say is that when this crisis is over, I want every news manager to remember just how hard the Black reporters in your newsroom worked and just the kind of excellence that they did. And don't marginalize them. Understand that just like they can cover this story, these stories, they can also cover politics. You know, we can also cover every beat there is. We can do health, we can do consumer, we can do every other thing. You know, and that is the aggravation of Black journalists is that they tend not to get the kind of opportunities to become investigative reporters, you know, to get out there in the campaign trail and cover all the politicians. They don't get those kind of opportunities. So it's unfair and it's frustrating when all of a sudden if a big story comes up and it's a Black story, yeah, now go cover, let the Black reporter do it. You know, and there's just a call of saying, fine, but be fair.
Right.
Patti, if I could add to as far as opportunity, and I mentioned earlier about NAHJ's Palabra, independent journalism is really filling a gaping holes that mainstream media can no longer do. So at the local level, because of budget constraints, and even more so as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, driven by COVID-19, the big media has lost its ability to cover local communities geographically, let alone from a diversity and inclusion standpoint of race and gender and sexual orientation. And so independent journalists like the Latino News Network that I'm affiliated with, that has 3 independent sites, that has a statewide community focus in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, they're telling stories at a level that big media no longer can. And you see that not only with the Hispanic community, but also African Americans, Asian Americans, LGBTQ. The opportunity from a business perspective in diversity and inclusion has always been there for corporate America, but because of the homogeneous leadership, they've been reluctant to take advantage of that opportunity. Now, because of technology, seasoned journalists, entrepreneurial journalists of every age are taking advantage of technology and filling in those gaps and doing a better job from a journalism standpoint, but also from a business perspective.
And I have to you know, compliment Hugo on the site that you guys, your platform, your digital platform that NAHJ is doing. NABJ was hoping to launch something literally last month sometime, and then all hell broke loose. You know, but we have been supporting many of our members who are entrepreneurs and have their own sites for the very same reason, because they are filling a void. And let me just say one other thing that I want people to understand. As a journalist, we all know you have to know when you get ready to cover a community, you need to know everything there is about that community. You need to know everything there is about that story, you know, and Black journalists are getting a little frustrated now, again, as Hugo said, because you end up being the ambassador, you know, and you don't mind wearing that hat, but you kind of want to say to your white colleagues, wait a minute, I have to know everything about every community in the city. So you know, there's a part of you that wants to say, would you do me a favor? Would you learn some more about the Black community? Because it's in this city as well. Can you go out of your way to just learn a little bit of the history and learn a little bit of the nuances and make those connections? Because I have to do it for every non-minority community, non-Black community. I can tell you about every community in the city of Chicago, something about every community in the city of Chicago. And that's not just because I've been here forever, you know, but it's because I do my homework, and I constantly do my homework, and I make those connections. And I embrace the connections that I have made when I do a story on every community. I want my colleagues to do the same thing for the Black community. So that
I'm gonna borrow that for my classes, Dorothy. Do your damn homework. Right?
Just in case I'm on vacation that week and I'm not around.
Right. Well, yeah.
Just in case you
absolutely.
can't get me, you know.
All right. With that, we are going to segue over to either Adam or Jordan, calling in some folks who have put questions in the chat field, and let's aim for 10 minutes, no more than 15, so people can get on with their Saturdays.
Great. So this is Jordan. I just unmuted Marie, so you can ask your question, Marie Torres.
Hi, thank you so much. And let me see if I can actually put my camera on so you can see me too. Maybe.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, I'm just coming from a walk. Hi, I am an Afro-Latina executive producer in the Raleigh market. And if I'm just allowed to quickly just share my truth, I honestly feel a bit of relief and a little bit of frustration over all of a sudden, because of the events, the now reaching out across the newsroom to hear and to talk to journalists like myself of color. And it's with frustration because I, just like many of my coworkers, have been pitching stories in the African American and Latinx communities and have been ignored for quite some time. And it wasn't until COVID really started impacting the Black Latinx communities, as well as what happened to Mr. Floyd, that now the olive branch is now being shared. And I'll be honest, like I said, again, it's frustration, but it's relief. I just wanted to know if those type of conversations are journalists of color in your newsrooms able to speak on that and say, these opportunities have been passed over many, many times. We're glad that you're now extending the olive branch, but realize that we've been also pitching these, and please acknowledge those. And I don't want this to pass once this is over.
Anybody would want to respond to that? This idea of all of a sudden Marie is being, you know, more valued, and good, bad.
Well, you know, I think as we've kind of already said it, you know, it is definitely happening. And Marie, I think it's important for you in the newsroom to keep pitching them and go back and bring up all the other stories that you pitched before and see if they'll get past this time. You know, in the community. I think it's also important for us to say again to our white colleagues to use this as an example. You know, this is exactly what people of color, this is what they experience. So we kind of want to say to our white colleagues now, when you were sitting in the room with me and I pitched that story and it went nowhere and nobody said anything, if you recognize that that's a halfway decent story, back me up. You know, speak up and say something at that point, because I could use your help, you know? And so in the future, you know, when perhaps we're no longer the flavor of the month, you know, remember that and continue to back me up in the future. But yeah, I mean, it is frustrating, but I'm glad you recognize, Maria, that it is also an opportunity. So I say, you know, strike while the iron is hot and baby, pitch as many stories as you possibly can.
And apply pressure. Apply pressure. You know, there's no change does not happen because of a kumbaya moment and people are enlightened. People are enlightened for the moment, but we know that as time goes by, that subsides. We have to continue to apply pressure as individual journalists in newsrooms that are not diverse, as organizations with decades of experience in doing the same. We cannot, this is the time when we have to double down. This is the time when we need to absolutely be open to the conversations, but also say, let's have a finite timetable in realizing those things. Because what happens is, with anything, we have a great conversation, we feel good, we lock arms, and then we go back to the real world. We go back to doing our jobs. We go back to the daily pressures. And then a day turns into a week turns into a month, and then 6 months later, a year later, we're like, hey, didn't we have a conversation, a meeting about diversity, inclusion, and equity? Whatever happened to that? It's on us to hold them accountable and continue to apply pressure.
And I would say that, you know, when these sorts of stories are being published more, I mean, I've personally been in newsrooms that I've been lucky that a lot of my newsrooms have cared about race in terms of coverage. I worked on at the Globe, I worked on a whole series of race series where we talked about disparities with Black people and Black and white communities in Boston. But in other newsrooms, if there are smaller newsrooms where it doesn't seem to be as much of a priority, I would say, I mean, get those receipts, get those page views, get those kinds of subscriptions that you're getting from the stories that you're pitching that did not get published before, and then make sure that you know, actually we got a ton of views, we got a ton of comments from this, we got a ton of subscriptions. So if it is, 6 months down the line, like Hugo's saying, like, we'll be able to say, actually, our community really cares about this. This is actually good for the bottom line of our organizations, because I mean, all of our organizations know it, like people do care about these issues. They do drive subscriptions, they do drive coverage, they make our organizations better. And if we have the kind of metrics that can actually where we can actually prove that to people who may not think that, I think that's important to look at as well. And it's kind of unfortunate that sometimes you have to prove it to people, but if you need to, those metrics are there for the taking.
I'm not seeing another question in the chat field, so would anybody like to offer a question or comment at this point?
Just Jordan, I actually have a question. I'm with SPJ New England. Thanks again for being here. I appreciate it. Question is just kind of, can you talk about if you've heard from your members more so during these events, and kind of, if not, how do you plan to use this this moment to kind of recruit people and let them know that you're a resource for journalists? Thanks.
Well, I do think we hit on that earlier, that most of you are capitalizing and people are gravitating towards you without a lot of prompting. But is there anything specific that you're going to do as a follow-up, to bring more people into the fold and into these conversations?
you know, what we're finding, and actually I think the NAHJ in Los Angeles did a great webinar that I saw, and the headline was, you know, how to address racism and keep your job, you know. And I think that is something that, you know, we're literally coming out with a statement and a list of, in your newsroom, you know, how you should approach your managers, how you should, when you are pitching a story and you feel like then you are silenced, you know, what do you do? How do you respond? When you feel like you are the victim of racial bias, you know, who do you feel comfortable talking to? You know, how do you have a conversation with your manager where you can express yourself without feeling like you're going to experience some retaliation? Because what we're seeing is some of the things that are happening on a local basis. If the local chapter reaches out, you know, unfortunately, I've heard from 3 of our members in different chapters who, because they are a member of that chapter and because the chapter put out something blasting that local news organization for, you know, doing something stupid, then the managers turn to them and say, well, you know, were you behind this? You know, are you responsible? You know, and it's just, and it's a lot of pressure. So I think that's something that we're trying to figure out, you know, how can we arm our members with information, and at the same time, let news managers know that you cannot, you know, you can't retaliate, and it is not fair. And it is a time when Black journalists are feeling like it's an opportunity for me to finally say to that manager, you know, when you did this, I thought it was unfair. You know, so managers need to know that if they come to you with a concern, don't automatically look at them and go, you know, now you're going to be a troublemaker, and, you know, they risk their jobs. You know, it's a very tense time in newsrooms, you know, and especially among Black journalists. And it is something that I lose sleep over, because I know our members are afraid. They're afraid to speak up, but at the same time, they know this is the time to speak up, and they should be speaking up. So, you know, we're trying to put, you know, a statement or recommendations together that address, you know, it's kind of a statement for both our members and our managers.
That sounds great. So a tip sheet of sorts will be available at some point soon.
Yeah.
And I also think that it's really up to the individual. Look, 50-year-old Hugo will tell you, I have left many good jobs, great companies, because of an unwillingness to be the token. And I feel very comfortable in my skin and speaking about what I see as systemic racism in media, and know that that's going to be detrimental to my career, whether it's advancement or just continuing in that workplace. So it's it's easier for me at 50 to say that than me at 22, 25 years old. But that's where I know I've benefited from the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, because that has been concurrent to my career. It's helped me be the journalist that I am today, but it's also helped me be the Latino Hispanic leader in media that I am today. And I've drawn from that well, continue to draw from that well, in order to deal with situations that, like, as I mentioned before, are very uncomfortable. But whether you're 50, 40, 30, at some point you need to make the decision, what is your, personally, what is your credibility, integrity, you know, what are your morals worth? Because if you do end up succumbing, you know, because of intimidation, because of fear, then that paycheck becomes what you feel your credibility and integrity is worth. And for me, luckily, having had the guidance throughout my whole career, I've been able to make decisions where I feel I've had very lucky to have a robust career, continue to have a robust career, making decisions that that do not compromise who I am as a journalist, but also as a member of the Hispanic Latino community.
And that is an advantage of being a member of NAHJ, being a member of NABJ. You know, there are people within the organization that you can turn to for advice. And, you know, and I'm sure like you, Hugo, I've made many phone calls to news directors on behalf of members in that newsroom, those who don't quite yet have the nerve, you know, they aren't quite there where, you know, perhaps you were at 25. And so, you know, I've spoken on behalf of, you know, the 2 or 3 people who were there, that one person, and just kind of been the go-between until they, you know, until they're able to build up that kind of strength. But being a member, you know, yeah, you've done it too. Yeah.
Nicole.
And I know these organizations are just really important for journalists at times like these. It's such a support network, you know, as somebody who has gone through AAJA and felt like almost every job I've gotten has been partly because of my connections here. I know that even just the conversations we have in our Slack, that people are exhausted. Everybody is exhausted. And so there have been a lot of honest conversations being had, and I think AAJA and organizations like NABJ and NAHJ help facilitate those conversations and help give those kinds of connections to a lot of journalists of color who may be in newsrooms where they feel like they are the only one. And that's really unfortunate. We're trying to change that. But I know that these organizations have been just very important to people as we've been more isolated than ever, you know, at a time like this. And we've been hearing a lot from our members about, you know, what do we do to be better allies to our Black colleagues, to our Latino colleagues, and we're trying to answer those questions and help with this moment to be able to say it's not just a burden that Black journalists, Hispanic journalists will always have to, you know, speak up for themselves. We're going to be there to stand with them and be better allies. And we've been trying to do that and we've been doing that. You know, we've had these connections with these organizations for decades, but you know, it's work that must be done all the time, and you have to be intentional, and you can't forget about it and just take it for granted. And so we're really happy about the connections we have within AAJA, but also the ones that we have always been forging with NABJ, NAHJ. I could go through all of the organizations, but it's a very strong umbrella of organizations, and I'm glad that we have it. And I'd love to connect with even more organizations because it's really helpful to journalists as they're starting out or if they're 20, 30 years into their career.
Right, and now is the moment, I'm going to give the mic lastly for the final question to Matt Hall. Matt is the president-elect of the SPJ board, and he's head of the opinion page at the San Diego Union Tribune. Matt?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
We can, hi.
Perfect. I'm on my morning walk, so I apologize if there's the wind sound in the background. But first, I just want to say thank you very much for this conversation and to all of the groups who have been doing the work for such a long time in it. I think the conversation has crystallized and expanded in the last couple of weeks, but you know, many people on this call and around the country have been doing the work for years and decades, so thanks to you. My 2 questions are these. I was really surprised at how quickly the AP, you know, in the last few weeks decided to capitalize Black. Now, this isn't all of the issue, and I apologize if this already came up earlier, but I do wonder, language and labeling, as we all know, is so important. So I guess my first question is, what other things can we do as a unit, right, as an industry, that might get some quick wins, some to show solidarity like that? Like, are there other things that are on the, you know, that you guys who have been doing the work for so long want to get next, that are cases like that we could do? I mean, our newspaper, I work at the San Diego Union Tribune, the LA Times and the UT are both owned by one guy, and we decided 2 weeks ago to start capitalizing Black. AP, you know, heard the call finally and did it as well. Some newspapers have done it before. The Black media has done it, you know, for years. But so I guess question 1 is, what can we do in meaningful ways like that? And the second question is a little more difficult, and it goes to kind of the more holistic approach in each newsroom, right? The big question is, who are the people in the newsroom? How do we get diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so our newspaper has started looking at who's on the staff, how we get more diversity on the staff. And so my question is, as an industry, should we, how do we start circulating those numbers for every newsroom so that those numbers are public and newsrooms can be held accountable and there can be some improvements over time? Kind of a long-winded way to ask those two questions.
Okay.
I just throw those out there. Thank you very much.
So Matt, because you did join late, we addressed those matters at the top of the conversation. So I think I'm just going to ask our three guests to wrap it up with a comment. I'll just kind of crystallize here. First of all, would you like to comment on this move to Black with a capital B, what you think of it? And then secondly, is there any other kind of very, a decision, a practice, a protocol that could make a difference that you'd love to see? Like if tomorrow we started doing X, it would help, right? And then Matt, in terms of the conversation about how to diversify newsrooms, I'll just ask you to go back and watch the tape. So first of all, capital B on Black, what do we think about that?
Look, I'll tell you, and Dorothy certainly can do a much better job than I do, but just because the AP made the recommendation does not mean that it's now adopted by newsrooms across the board. About 15 years ago, the AP made the recommendation not to use the word illegal alien in describing persons coming to the United States crossing the border, undocumented immigrants. And there are few newsrooms that at that time adopted or stopped using those derogatory terms and used undocumented immigrants, or be very specific in the action of coming to the United States illegally through the border or outstaying your visa, et cetera. So the first thing to do is, great that the AP is made that suggestion in their style guide. Now it's on us in newsrooms to adopt them, to integrate them into our individual style guides, and to have the conversations in the newsroom and enforce it. So what can you do? That's exactly what you need to do. And then again, specifically speaking for NHJ, what can you do as we're circling the November election, where we know, like it's been the last 4 years, coming from the Trump administration, incessant attacks to the Hispanic Latino community focused on illegal immigration. Do not use illegals, do not use illegal aliens, even in a quote, because it is incorrect, it's not fair, and what you're doing is perpetuating misinformation.
Dorothy.
Mugshots. I mentioned that at the top, but that is going to be something that we are going to begin to really stress, because mugshots for Black and brown people in particular, it is the narrative of the police. They will always provide you a mugshot of the Black person, of the Hispanic person, without you asking. But sometimes you have to ask for the mugshots of the others. And then I think in news, we have a tendency to use that because it's an easy way to fill the show, or to just throw the picture out there. And oftentimes these people are never charged. The charges are dropped, and we don't come back and take the mugshot down. It's on our website forever, and that poor person can't get a job. That poor person is just ruined. And then we use mugshots of if it's a juvenile but the charge is an adult, we put the mugshot on. Mm-hmm. And we do that without questioning. We do that without thinking about it. And I'm not saying that across the board that you make a policy to say no mugshots. I'm just asking newsrooms to take a look at when they use it, and especially when not to use it. Because you can still put the story out there without automatically putting that mugshot out there, because it just kind of paints a picture for people who are watching television, that you look up on your TV and you see another Black person, yep, and it's a mugshot. You see another brown person, yep, and it's a mugshot. What does that say? It sends that kind of image or message that Blacks are mostly criminals. We know that's not the fact, but it does kind of send that message out there because it's on television. So that's something that we'll be tackling.
Another very tangible step. Nicole, last word. Any other tangible step you'd like to see happen? I love Hugo's suggestion and Dorothy's. How about you?
I mean, it almost seems like coronavirus happened so long ago because there's been so much news, but at least from AAJA, I know that toward the beginning, we had to put out advisories because we were seeing a lot of people using pictures indiscriminately of Asians or Chinatowns to represent coronavirus in some way. Asians in masks, even if it had nothing to do with where you were, with what article you were actually posting. I mean, those are, you know, as coronavirus, as this pandemic continues to go forward, that's another way to kind of combat bias within your newsroom. I know that we all have, each of our organizations, you know, we put out these advisories, we put out these best practices, and I just hope that all the newsrooms do care about them, do read them, because, you know, people have been using capital B for Black for years, but I think it's also important for us to just, in terms of coverage, to be as specific as possible. Like, we shouldn't be hiding behind terms when really we mean Black, or really we mean Latino, or really we mean Asian. We shouldn't just be saying diverse when really we mean Black communities or Black and Latino communities. We need to be as specific as possible. And I think that's something that we just have to do coverage-wise, to be inclusive and as specific as possible whenever we see that. And that might be, you know, if you see an article that's been posted and it's not as specific as possible because they're saying people of color, but really they mean Black, I mean, you should tell the reporter, you know, maybe you mean Black, maybe you actually just mean Latino. And those are little things that we can do on the individual side, even if it's not a policy to look forward to.
Thank you very much to you, Nicole, Hugo, Dorothy, for joining this very rich conversation. A lot of great specific takeaways on how to make improvements, how to seize the moment, and continue the fight for more diversity in our newsrooms and better coverage of stories of the moment. So thanks again to SPJ New England for hosting this, and I'm wishing you all a happy Saturday and hopefully a little time off from the job.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.